I recognize the member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise to speak to Bill 28, the Miscellaneous Statutes Housing Priority Initiatives Amendment Act. And I want to begin, Honourable Speaker, with the title, because I think there's some irony in the title of this bill, which talks about Housing Priority Initiative Act, given that we've seen just the opposite, in fact, from this government, just the opposite when it comes to priorities around housing. And we only need to look back to when this government was elected in 2001 to see whether it's social housing, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's supports for tenants and rental housing, whether it's building co-op housing. This government has completely neglected the crisis that we've seen in British Columbia. They cut programs and services for affordable housing for the most vulnerable in this province. From 2002, when they began their core review, Honourable Speaker, this government gutted supports for housing and for the most vulnerable. That was the direction that they took. And we are seeing the results of that all across this province. I have seen it right here in my own home community with a tent city, Honourable Speaker, that grew up out of a lack of affordable supported housing in our city. It was something that they've been told by opposition, by social groups, by the homeless, by community organizations, by the incredible not-for-profit sector in this province that works so incredibly hard without supports to be able to try and provide for the most vulnerable, to be able to try and provide for families and others in our province, seniors who aren't able to find housing. And that's the result, again, of what we've seen by this government since 2002. So it should be no surprise that we're standing in this House talking about an affordability crisis, talking about a housing crisis, when you look at the record of this government. And so I want to take my time today, Honourable Speaker, to speak about three particular areas. First, I want to talk about the approach that the government has taken on this bill, because it's an approach and a pattern that we have seen in a number of areas from this government. And I think it's important to put it on the public record because I think it speaks to a lack of direction and a lack of a thoughtful approach to governing in British Columbia. Second, Honourable Speaker, I want to talk about the specifics of this bill and talk about what's in it and what is not. And third, Honourable Speaker, I'd like to talk about what could have been. I often hear this government saying, well, what ideas have you got? Well, in fact, I want to put forward those ideas that were proposed a number of months ago by our leader and by the official opposition, Honourable Speaker. So I want to start in speaking to Bill 28. I want to start with this government's approach to this legislation. We've seen, Honourable Speaker, for more than a year now, that this Premier and this government and the Minister, both the Finance Minister as well as the Housing Minister, have denied and mocked any concerns that have been raised around a crisis in the real estate market and a crisis in housing in British Columbia. And I just want to read a few of these comments because I think this government often tries to pretend that they are the first to come to a problem and raise the solution that's there. But in fact, this government has done just the opposite. So back in May 2015, so we're talking about not this year, last year, Honourable Speaker, the Housing Minister said, if you look at the mean cost of housing across British Columbia or the Lower Mainland and compare it to other cities worldwide, it's attractive internationally. It's actually pretty reasonable compared to other cities across the world. There's no initiative in government at this time to go and interfere in the marketplace. We don't believe in that. There's no initiative or research that we're doing from this ministry with regard to that. Is that listening to the concerns that came forward, Honourable Speaker? This is a year ago that we were hearing some very valid issues. So what did the Premier say in June of 2015? The Premier said, there are a lot of great places to live. Fort St. John is booming. It won't be long before you see lots of new people in Kitimat and Prince Rupert. The views are amazing, by the way. Scorn to people who are seriously struggling with affordability and trying to provide for their families. And Honourable Speaker, the people who come forward and talk to us, and I'm sure talk to government as well, aren't heard by government, aren't listened to by government, but who come forward, don't expect government to do everything for them. These are hard-working families. They're doing everything right. They're working, they're trying to provide for their children, and they just can't manage things. And the answer from this government when they come forward with those genuine concerns is, well, just move. The views are great somewhere else. Or we'll make it more difficult for you. Why don't we hike your hydro rates? Why don't we make it more difficult with MSP? Why don't we make sure tuition is out of reach for you and your family so opportunity doors are closed as well? That seems to be the approach and the answer that this government takes when genuine, hardworking families are coming forward with real concerns. In February of this year, 2016, let's fast forward. This has been a year of trying to raise these concerns to government. The Minister of Finance says, "We make housing policy, and I know this will perhaps shock some people who think a certain part of Vancouver is home. We make policy for all of British Columbia, not just one part. I'm sorry, but we govern for the whole province." Well, I'll come back to the specifics in this bill, Honourable Speaker, in Bill 28 that we're debating today, that in fact only apply to Vancouver, and other parts of the bill that in fact only apply to Metro Vancouver. So just the opposite, in fact, of what the Minister of Finance said. And finally, I think the topper that describes this government's attitude when it comes to concerns that come forward came from the Minister of Housing, who said, "I guess some people just have to get up and whine every day. I don't know, you just have to look at the glass as half full and not half empty, right?" Well, Honourable Speaker, that kind of attitude has no place in a government that is supposed to represent all of British Columbia. These are genuine worries coming forward from individuals and families. Real concerns. Affordability is a real issue, and ignoring and ridiculing people and mocking people is not the way to approach things. But, Honourable Speaker, and I think this is the most critical piece, when it's a problem for the Premier, not for families, not for British Columbians, not for individuals who work hard, but when it becomes a problem for the Premier, too many headlines, too many questions in a scrum, maybe a few polls, oh, an election year, this coming year, then the government decides they better do something. Then the government decides that they better come forward with something. Well, I'm sorry, Honourable Speaker, that is a terrible way to run government. That is a terrible way to run government, to decide only to act when it becomes a problem for the Premier, not when it's a problem for real British Columbians who this government is supposed to be acting on behalf of. And what does that lead to, Honourable Speaker? Well, it leads to ideas and approaches on the back of a napkin. It leads to policy solutions that are not thought out. It leads to unintended consequences. It leads to a lack of consultation, which means concerns aren't addressed. But it is pretty clear, as I said, Honourable Speaker, that this government isn't interested in addressing real concerns. They're only interested in addressing concerns that matter to them, for themselves. And I'm sad to say, Honourable Speaker, that it's not simply the housing issue that this applies to. This is a pattern we see across government. I'm speaking about it because it relates to Bill 28. But in fact, if you take a look at, for example, education, you see exactly the same thing. Just as the government did with housing, where they said there wasn't a problem, people should quit whining, they should just be quiet about it. That's just what they do in education as well. Oh, school boards and those parents that complain about their kids and not enough money in education, they should just stop complaining. There's lots of money. And in fact, the Premier said in the area of education, there's low-hanging fruit. School boards should just go and make efficiencies and make cuts. That's how they should address it. Well, Honourable Speaker, just as with this housing bill that we're here debating today, it happens to be an election year this year. And so the Premier and the Minister of Education came forward and decided that they give some money back to school boards after saying the school boards had a lot of money. Now, they took credit for giving them their own money back, which is really quite something, quite an accomplishment, to stand up and take credit and send out a press release for giving school boards back their own money that they had cut because the government had required it. But that was their argument. Boards have done such a good job, we think that they deserve to be rewarded for that. Well, again, as I mentioned with the housing bill, it's a terrible way to run government, Honorable Speaker. And again, just like the housing issue that we're debating today, this government told school boards there was no problem. On school closures, get on with closing schools, they told the school boards. But this year, when it happens to be an election year, I'm sure only a coincidence, Honorable Speaker, they decided that they put a fund forward that people could access to be able to keep schools from being closed. Well, Honorable Speaker, what happened for those school boards over the last 3 years that closed schools? And just like the housing bill, what happened to all those families who couldn't afford housing over this last year? Didn't matter then. It didn't matter over this last year. It didn't matter for school boards that were closing schools. It didn't matter for those families. But now when it's election year, it matters, Honorable Speaker. Now it's election year, we better bring the legislature back in July. Now it's election year, we better make sure that we've got a fund put aside to keep those schools from closing, because we wouldn't want that to happen, because it's a problem for the Premier and the government. They didn't care when it was a problem for families. They didn't care when it was a problem for parents and for students. A terrible way, Honorable Speaker, to run government. So the pattern from this government is deny the problem, slam the real concerns that come forward, and then when the pressure becomes a problem, scramble and put something together. Call the legislature back and say, oh, we've discovered it's a problem. We have the answer for it. We have the solution. Well, let's take a look at the legislation, Honorable Speaker. Let's take a look at the specifics that are in Bill 28 and see whether they actually do address the concerns that have come forward. There are 4 measures in this bill, Honorable Speaker. The first, which is the one that I think most people have heard about, that they're hearing about in the news, is an additional tax using the property transfer tax of 15% on residential purchases in Metro Vancouver by foreign nationals, which is the term that the government uses in the legislation. The second piece of this legislation is a new fund that's going to be created. And it's a fund called the Housing Priority Initiatives Fund. And additional revenue from that 15% tax is going to go into that fund, along with $75 million from government. The third piece of this piece of legislation is a move to end self-regulation for the real estate industry. And the fourth and final piece, Honorable Speaker, are amendments to the Vancouver Charter to provide Vancouver and only Vancouver with the authority to implement a vacancy tax. So I want to take a few minutes just to unpack each of those areas, because I think it's important for the public to know what has come forward in this legislation, what are the areas that the government scrambled to put into a bill, and then, as I said, I'll close off by talking about what might have been. I think most people will have taken a look at the 15% tax and presume that it might address the issue of speculation in the housing market. But I want to raise a number of questions and a number of concerns that arise with this approach. This approach takes focus at foreign nationals and citizenship status, rather than foreign money that might be coming in and might be used for speculation or for money laundering. And my colleague from Vancouver Point Grey, I think, described it very well when he said that this bill taxes who you are, in other words, your citizenship status, rather than what you are doing. Are you here paying taxes? Are you here contributing in the province? Or are you not? And I think that's a very important distinction to take a look at, because it truly does leave huge loopholes for folks to avoid paying the taxes. It also does nothing to address any of the speculation money that is already in the housing market. It addresses new money coming in, buying properties, but it does nothing to address any money that may be here already. And so again, I'll come back to that. It also doesn't address the loophole that might be set up with Canadian companies or companies set up in Canada that could be using foreign money to purchase property. They're going to be exempt. They don't have to pay because, again, it's not a foreign national, as is the term used in this legislation. It's not a foreign national buying the property. It's, in fact, a company set up by somebody else. I think there have been lots of questions raised around property that may be bought by a foreign student coming in and utilizing some time here to be able to purchase property. So I think it's important to remember the questions that are unanswered with utilizing, as I said, the issue of citizenship rather than the issue of are you here, are you contributing? Are you paying taxes? If you look at people who are in fact invited to come to British Columbia, whether it's doctors coming to British Columbia because we may have a shortage, whether it's other professionals where we have a shortage and people come in, there's a real challenge when you take a look at using citizenship to say that that's going to be the criteria, and yet they're paying taxes and they're contributing here in the province. That's very different than someone who is not paying taxes and who is putting foreign money in as simply an investment, or, as I said, questions being raised around money laundering, illegal money, drug money, etc., being utilized where you can track because there is no income tax being paid in the province by those individuals. So a very different approach that's being taken here. I also think it's important, you know, that the ministers spoke before me talked about the government taking the time to be able to put this together. Well, I think there are a whole number of things that we can point to that show time wasn't taken. In fact, the government could have acted months ago on this issue. But I think the one that I just want to mention is the issue of collecting data. We had suggested a long number of months ago that the government needed to start collecting data on foreign ownership. Seems like a basic step. If you're looking at the challenges of money coming in and you're looking at the real estate market, you want to make sure that you're collecting data when you're looking, particularly when you're looking at a tax or looking at some kind of penalty for people. And yet again, this government and the finance minister refused to act, refused to move on collecting that basic information. And in the end, because of mounting pressure from the outside, pressure from bad headlines, pressure from the opposition, the government decided that they better start collecting self-reporting citizenship status. And when did they start collecting that information, Honourable Speaker? They started collecting that information in June, mid-June. Not last June 2015, but this June, just a few weeks ago, to start putting the information together to be able to bring this legislation forward. So when the members stand up and say this has been a thoughtful approach and we've taken our time, I think this alone shows that is an absolutely ridiculous statement. In the end, it was 25 days of data that was collected for this legislation to come forward. It certainly doesn't, from my perspective, and I don't think from the public's perspective, point to thoughtful policy work. A point to taking the time to do proper planning on anything that's come forward. I think another huge, very valid question and concern that has come forward is the fact that this foreign speculation tax only applies to Metro Vancouver. Well, let's remember, and I read the quote at the beginning of my time, Honourable Speaker, it was only 6 months ago that the finance minister actually stood up and said, we make housing policy for all of British Columbia, not simply for some parts of the province, we make it for everyone. Well, here we are, yeah, exactly, except when we don't. And here we are debating a piece of legislation that simply applies to one part of the province, Metro Vancouver. You know, it should be no surprise to the government that other municipalities, including the municipality I live in Victoria and others in our region, are really concerned about foreign speculation that's now going to be pushed to our area. And this is something we've already been seeing pressure over the last year, but pressure in particular over the last number of months, 6 to 8 months, where individuals are receiving in their mailboxes, myself included, 2 or 3 times a week, flyers saying we have foreign buyers, we're ready to purchase your home, just give us a call, we're prepared for it. Those are things that have been happening already in Victoria. Outbidding, which is not something that normally we have seen, is happening in Victoria. We have people who are having people knock on their doors, driving around on weekends in neighborhoods, asking people if they're interested in selling their house. And so I think, again, when you take a look at the challenges of scrambling to bring something forward to address the Premier's problem and the government's problem, not the family's problems and the challenges of individuals who are looking for housing, there's going to be consequences. And the clear consequence here is when a tax only applies to one particular area of the province, you're going to see buyers move to other areas that don't have the tax. It's pretty straightforward. That's going to be a big problem. It's going to be a big problem in other markets. And I heard the minister say, well, you know, other municipalities can come forward to UBCM the end of September and they can raise concerns. Well, why didn't the government listen and do it right in the first place? I think that's a very valid question for the public to ask. If it was an issue and the government knew it was going to be an issue, why didn't they take the time and do it right in the first place? Or act back in February and January when these concerns were coming forward, or a year ago when the issues were raised. So they didn't have to scramble and bring something forward. The second piece in this bill that I just want to speak to, Honourable Speaker, is the creation of a Housing Priorities Initiative Fund. And as I mentioned, this is a fund that the government proposes to put together in this legislation that would receive the dollars from the new foreign buyers tax. Now, I'm a big supporter of spending money on affordable housing, Honourable Speaker. I think a housing fund is a much needed and a long overdue step. But like everything else in this bill, in Bill 28, there are a number of unanswered questions. How is the money going to be used? We already have, and we saw it in the spring session, we already have the Premier's Fantasy Fund that has $100 million in it from taxpayer money that, if you'll remember, was actually going to be money from an LNG industry that didn't materialize. That's a $100 million fund for the Premier without specifics around how those dollars are going to be spent. And so I think, again, it's a very valid question to ask whether this fund is going to become one more fund for the Premier and for the government to be able to use and to draw down in what happens to be an election year. I think that's a very valid question. The member says I'm a bit cynical. Yeah, I think at this point, the government has given me lots of reasons to be cynical. Lots of reasons, Honourable Speaker. Given this government's promises in the 2013 election, there is good reason to be cynical, to be skeptical, to be questioning the kind of approaches that are using. We'll all remember debt-free. Debt-free when we just saw public accounts come out with the largest debt we've seen in British Columbia. Eliminate MSP premiums. I believe that was also a promise made in 2013. So I think there's some very good reasons to be skeptical about this government putting a fund together that doesn't seem to have the kinds of checks and balances that are necessary, the kind of accountability around the spending of public dollars that is expected by the public. And that is good government, to be able to be accountable for those public dollars. The powers in this fund, in this legislation, appear to be pretty open-ended. An ability to make loans, to guarantee repayments of loans, to acquire, to construct, to maintain, to renovate housing. Again, as I said, I'm all for spending money on affordable housing, but given this government's track record on other areas, it's critical that those checks and balances be in place. And so I'm very concerned about that section of the bill as well, Honourable Speaker. The third area in this bill is the move away from self-regulation for the real estate industry. And, you know, again, I think we have to remind everybody that who moved the government, who moved this industry to self-regulation? Why, it happened to be this government. In 2004, in an effort to end red tape, the finance minister of the day, Gary Collins, and I'll just read from his quote, said that these changes will help to ensure that this important industry remains a vibrant part of our economy for years to come. By replacing the Act, we're ensuring that people who retain the services of professionals or purchase units are better protected and at the same time reduce unnecessary regulatory requirements. Well, Honorable Speaker, here we are putting back in place those regulatory requirements. Think of all the years lost. And I also want to say that it's important to note that the vast majority of real estate agents are ethical and supportive and work properly in the industry. And the reason that you need to make sure that the regulations are there is to weed out the few bad apples so that the good real estate agents, the vast majority of people in this industry, aren't targeted with that bad behavior. Because when there are a few bad apples, Honorable Speaker, people presume the whole industry is the problem. And it's not. It's a few bad apples, but because this government got rid of regulation and put in place self-regulation, those few bad apples were able to wreak havoc and cause problems for individuals. So it's a good move. I'm glad this part is coming, but again, let's remember, it's this government who brought it in as a way of reducing red tape. So they're fixing their own mistake. And the last piece, of course, is the vacancy tax. And again, the finance minister ridiculed the idea of a vacancy tax. He called it an economic wall, that the opposition, how dare we propose something like a vacancy tax? And it took the mayor of Vancouver to give an ultimatum to this government to say, we're going to go on our own if you don't act, for this government to actually finally do something. And yet again, instead of thoughtful planning, instead of doing something that was going to support the province, this government decides, well, we'll try it out. We'll put a vacancy tax in place in Vancouver. Well, Honorable Speaker, you could have different sides of the street having different rules in place. And again, it might be a tool, and my city in Victoria has said it may be a tool that they might want to use now or in the future. They're starting to look at how they can gather the information to know whether it's going to be a helpful tool. Well, if this government had planned, instead of only reacting when it becomes a problem for them, we wouldn't see this kind of piecemeal approach. We wouldn't see where one city has one set of rules and next door or across the street there's another set of rules. And so, Honorable Speaker, what might have been? Well, in fact, in March, a number of months ago, our leader tabled an act in this legislature that was called the Housing Affordability Fund and Speculator Fee Act. This act was researched. In fact, it looked at a proposal, a very innovative proposal that came forward from the Sauder School of Business and 40 economists that actually looked at if someone wanted to buy property in British Columbia and they don't pay their worldwide taxes here, that they'd have to pay a speculation fee. Now, the advantage of this, Honorable Speaker, very different than the bill that's in front of us, the advantage of this is that it addresses both the current and the future market. The government's proposal simply looks at the future market and only catches one piece. Our proposal actually looks at the current and future market. You link it to someone paying taxes. We also said that we wouldn't penalize simply immigrants or people who come to British Columbia, but in fact people who aren't contributing and aren't paying taxes. We also, in our legislation, proposed a task force to fight tax fraud and money laundering, a proposal to end shadow flipping and close loopholes. We also proposed better tenant support, better protection for renters, rent evictions, a huge area in my community that I've held a number of meetings on, where there are big loopholes there that need to be addressed, protection for manufactured home owners. So, Honorable Speaker, while I'm glad that the government has finally brought something forward, it could have been so much more. It could have been so much more. It could have been a comprehensive housing policy. We proposed in March an act that the government was welcome to take and could have implemented that would have touched on all of those areas, not just a piecemeal approach, that would have looked at a long-term housing strategy, that would have begun to address the affordability issue that is a crisis for families around our province. A crisis created by this government, whether we're talking about housing or MSP, whether we're talking about hydro or tuition, whether we're talking about ICBC, you name it, this government has made life harder for families. And now, when it's becoming a problem for them, they've decided they better scramble and put something together. So while I'm glad, as I said, Honorable Speaker, I'm glad that something has come forward, it could have been so much more. There's a real opportunity to actually act on behalf of the people of British Columbia, which is what a government is supposed to do. And instead, what we see, Honourable Speaker, is a government that acts on behalf of themselves when it becomes a problem, and the rest of the time ignores the public. Well, Honourable Speaker, that needs to change on behalf of the public of British Columbia. Thank you.